Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the program. And thank you for joining us for Trent Talks and this week's episode, The Future of Canada. I'm Stephen Stone, Trent University Chancellor and proud alumnus. Today, we are joined by the Director of the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies, Professor David Newhouse, and Trent School for the Study of Canada Professor, Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer. What does tomorrow look like? I guess it depends if we're thinking about politics or reconciliation or different geographic areas of the country. So let's explore a few of these today. First, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that Trent University is located on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. David and Whitney, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get into our audience-submitted questions, could I ask you both a bit about your research focuses? And David, maybe beginning with you?
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I came to Trent now about 27 years ago. I decided that when I came to Trent, I was never going to investigate what had been called, what researchers call the Indian problem. There's an enormous number of people looking at problems within our community. And I wanted my contribution to focus upon what type of society we are trying to build. Now, we're moving to urban environments, we're building communities in urban environments. And so my most recent work is focused upon how we're building good communities, good families in urban environments. I did a study in 2011 with Environics, in which we looked at what urban Indigenous people are interested in. And what we discovered was something quite startling, was that about 75% of our 2,200 person sample said that the city was home. That's quite a change. Most Canadians think of Indigenous people as rural. And yet we have an enormous number of people who live in a city. In Ontario, about 85% of Indigenous people live in urban environments. And so that's my focus, is trying to understand what type of society is emerging and what type of society we're trying to create. We want to use our own values, we want to use our own knowledges. So how are we translating all of those into action? That's what I'm interested in.
Well, thank you, David. And now, Whitney, could you tell us about your research focus?
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. Much of my research looks at the historical and contemporary forces that shape how we understand Canada and its place in the circumpolar north. And to do this, I spend a lot of time contemplating Canadian identities and interests and modes of governance and relationships more broadly. I'm particularly interested in how Canada can and should balance issues like sovereignty and security and stewardship responsibilities in our north. How can we do this in ways that protects national interests and values, promotes sustainable development and healthy communities, and facilitates circumpolar stability and cooperation? So with my team, I examine how Canada's domestic strategies for the north have evolved, as well as our international relationships with other Arctic and non-Arctic states. And most years I find myself in Yukon, Northwest Territories, or Nunavut for about 3 months of the year, where I seek to learn how northern communities have shaped and have been shaped by different understandings of the region as a homeland. And this spring and summer has been different, of course, but my overall research goals remain the same. I strive to contribute not only to academic and public debate, but also to encourage and support evidence-based policymaking that's animated by a strong commitment to social justice and a desire to advance Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples through reconciliation in its myriad forms.
Well, thank you both. That sounds fascinating. And I'd never heard the word circumpolar before, but yeah, that's great. Let's move into our audience-submitted questions. David, turning to you first, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and other people in Canada, largely speaking the federal and provincial governments, that relationship has been a difficult one. How has the pandemic affected reconciliation efforts? And how do we best continue the reconciliation process and make significant improvements to the relationship?
Well, first of all, let me talk a bit about the pandemic and its impact upon Indigenous communities, primarily First Nations communities on reserve. As of August 1st, there were 404 cases in First Nations on-reserve communities right across the country. 354 of those have now been are now recovered, and the data shows that the curve is flattening. And so what we're seeing in that are Indigenous communities, First Nations communities that are prepared, that are resilient, that are determined, and that have some capacity. Right? If we had been in the pandemic a half century ago, the situation on First Nations communities would be very strong. And so I think what the pandemic has begun to show is First Nations communities, right, as strong, as resilient, and beginning to move or come out of this very, very long period of history that I call the long assault, right, which other people call colonization. And we're beginning to build capacity, we're beginning to see ourselves differently, and we're beginning to be able to engage in a conversation with Canadians about that history, right? So Canada has now been in an official policy of reconciliation now for 5 years. We've begun to do some of the easiest things. We've begun to talk about truth, right? But there's still an enormous amount to do, right? We've talked about land acknowledgement. We've talked about cultural awareness. We've done those things. So there is now an awareness of an Indigenous presence in the land. Right? So the next step is the hard part, right? And that, I think, is going to be a real challenge, right? I mean, our resources are going to be constrained, and there may not necessarily be an appetite for institutional change, because an institutional reform, right? Because that's the next step. We have to then begin to use the capacity that we demonstrated in the pandemic in order to begin to rebuild and we begin to change our relationship with Canadians. And we have to begin to change Canadian institutions as much as our own. We have to begin to find ways to ensure there's an Indigenous presence in every decision-making body across the country where it makes sense for us to be. Right? We need to build an institutional capacity in Canada, both at the provincial level and at the municipal level, to deal with our issues. And that's the hard part. Right, we did a study now about 3 years ago in looking at Indigenous presence in 3 Canadian cities, in Saskatchewan, and in Regina, in Saskatoon, and in Manitoba, right, in Winnipeg. And we tried to get a sense of whether in fact Indigenous presence would be welcomed. And people were very much interested in cultural presence, but we begin to talk about beginning to build an Indigenous presence in governance and in decision-making. There was a great deal of resistance. And that's the hard part, right? Because what that means, if we don't do that, then it's going to be difficult for us to exercise our own self-determination, our own self-governance. And those are the challenges. And that takes institutional reform, that also takes money. And so money is going to be a determining factor in the next short while. But I'm quite convinced that we do have the capacity. We demonstrated that we can protect our own communities. We can act upon our own interest. Right, in the pandemic, those 404 cases are very small compared to what it could have been.
Well, I agree with everything Professor Newhouse has just said. You touched on challenges of funding. I worry about how Canadian governments are going to balance the growing debt load that we've assumed to manage the COVID-19 crisis and all of the economic uncertainty that's surely going to come in its wake with investment priorities that Indigenous peoples has long identified as essential to meet their core needs. This includes funding that helps to empower Indigenous governments to act on their own decisions about their desired futures, including building stronger, more diversified Indigenous economies. And although we've seen some strides made in infrastructure investments to ensure safe, clean drinking water, things like adequate housing and internet connectivity and treatment centers and schools, nearly everyone acknowledges that much remains to be done. And Professor Newhouse mentioned in a wonderful 2018 article that conversations about Crown Indigenous relationships and quality of life in Indigenous peoples are inextricably linked, and that these conversations have to go on simultaneously as we seek reconciliation. I think this is particularly important to keep in mind as we navigate beyond the pandemic and seek to restore meaningful and practical nation-to-nation relationships in Canada.
If I could just add a bit, now what the pandemic has also done is shown us the structures of power and that exist in the country and the way in which those structures of power has led to inequity. And so our big challenge now is trying to ensure that we can recast all those institutions that exercise power, right, so that we can begin to deal with inequities. That means dealing with things like police reform. It means dealing with things like overcrowding in prisons. It means dealing with the issues around women and children, right? And doing it in a way that invites us to the table so we're part of the solution. Right? We're past the stage, I think, where people do things to us and for us. We're now at the stage where we want to do things in partnership with the rest of Canada. And I think that's extremely important, and that's going to take some time and effort and changes in attitudes. And I think that's beginning to change, but it's going to take an enormous amount of effort.
Well, thank you both. And now one of our audience questions for you, Whitney. Much of your work focuses on Canada's north, a region important to national identity, but also one that is perhaps often, regretfully, overlooked by many Canadians. Could you give us your views on what part the North and Northern people will play in the future of Canada?
Well, thanks for the question. The North, which is defined in many different ways, occupies a distinctive place within Canada's national identity. Often the region is cast as a resource-rich frontier of destiny, as well, a homeland for Indigenous peoples, a fragile environment in need of protection, particularly in the face of global climate change, and also a more amorphous idea of this source of national inspiration, right? It's a region that fires up the Canadian imagination, particularly when Canadians perceive that somebody might take it away from us. Yet it's also a place that the vast majority of Canadians have never visited, never mind lived in. So it inspires us, but it haunts us with its isolation, its historic inaccessibility, its frigid temperatures, and this possibility that it could be the key to Canada's future. I think it's very central to our sense of scale on the world stage, right? We're the second largest country on Earth, and 40% of our land mass is in the territories, 3.7 million square kilometers. Without the territories, we drop to a modest 6th place in the world rankings of country by size. And it's the seeming eternalness of the North, the reach of our country into the austerity of the Arctic, that makes our maps, our mental maps and our physical maps so unique. And even in the 21st century, with most Canadians living in southern urban areas where a Canada Goose Park is more of a status symbol than a necessity, politicians still turn to the North to try to inspire us. And the historic idea of the North as this resource-rich frontier remains front and center, right? It comes back to the days of the Klondike Gold Rush, or Prime Minister John Diefenbaker's Northern Vision in the late 1950s, or pipeline debates in the 70s, or the diamond mining boom in the 1990s. And it's taken on a whole new sense of urgency, with global warming generating new images of open waters and access to resource that have long been frozen in the Arctic's embrace. So there's a sense of opportunity, right? Calls to complete our nation building to finally capitalize on the richness of our northern resources. Yet this frontier image is just one part of Southern Canadian ideas of the North, as Justice Thomas Berger imprinted in our minds back in the 1970s, when his landmark inquiry reminded Southern Canadians the most striking reality of all, that what to many of us is a resource frontier is actually a homeland for Indigenous peoples. And this frontier homeland dichotomy has been embedded in our national consciousness ever since. So Southern Canadians now tend to think of the Arctic as an Indigenous space. We marvel at Inuit, First Nations, and Métis adaptability and resilience and vibrant cultures. And our vision of an Indigenous Arctic is something that Canada has successfully exported abroad, particularly through the Arctic Council. But using the North as a source of national inspiration also makes the Arctic a source of national anxiety. The way that we imagine the Arctic makes it a focal point for our insecurities in a rapidly changing, uncertain world. Focuses our attention on our failures to live up to our responsibilities towards Indigenous Canadians and responsibilities to a world that's being reshaped by climate change. So we frequently get caught up in rhetoric about sovereignty, right? A noble idea, of course, reinforcing that a significant slice of the Arctic is ours. And many of us have heard alarmist narratives about the Americans disputing our ownership of the Northwest Passage as our internal waters, or potential battles with the Russians over the continental shelf around the North Pole, or Chinese interests buying up mining sites in the Canadian Arctic. Sure, this is about the Arctic, but it's also an expression of our anxiety would say even our paranoia about our inability as a country to stand up to powerful neighbors and to stand up to non-Arctic states that are suddenly eager to participate in Arctic affairs. Now, I typically argue that when we fixate on Arctic sovereignty as something we might lose, we actually lose sight of critical priorities. The key security challenges are not defense-related threats to the region. They are human and environmental security ones in the region. They're about access to food. They're about the lack of suitable housing. They're about what Silawatt Kluche referred to as Indigenous Northerners' right to be cold. They're about that inexcusable spate of deplorable social indicators that remind us of our shortcomings as a country in fulfilling our obligations to fellow Canadians who live in the Arctic. So ultimately, I believe that Southern Canadians still have a way to go to internalize the Arctic as a here, not as a there. And I think that our future lies in discerning new ways of conceptualizing Arctic development in ways that move beyond conventional return on investment models of economic development, that fit with 21st century models of nation building, or should I say nation to nation building, that reflect an overarching by Northerners, for Northerners philosophy. And they also need to showcase how intertwined sovereignties between Canada, Inuit, Dene, Gwich'in, Cree, and other Indigenous rights holders can be recognized and practiced in mutually beneficial and reinforcing ways, and that we all benefit from the sense of coming together.
And Whitney, another question for you. Regionalism is a recurring theme in Canada's national identity. From Victoria to St. John's, from Alert to Windsor, we see the significant differences in each region. Is there a way to better mend regional differences? And if I can simultaneously beg the question, should we indeed in all cases mend the differences, or rather should we be embracing the differences?
Well, I see regionalism as an inescapable part of the Canadian experience, right? It's shaped us since well before settlers arrived from Europe, right? We just have to look to the linguistic, cultural, and political diversity of Indigenous peoples in Northern North America or Turtle Island to see this clearly. I confess that I often see the country through an Ontario or a Central Canadian lens, but I came to recognize early in my academic career that Canada is interesting precisely because there is no single way of encapsulating what it means. I spent most of my time as an undergraduate student in the mid-1990s trying to make sense of English-French relations, then went out to do my graduate and postdoctoral studies in Calgary and Saskatoon, partly so I could contemplate how Western Canadians feel about Canada and Canadianness. And now I've spent most of the last 15 years seeking to understand how Northerners conceptualize their place in Canada. So I now tend to concede that I do not think that regional differences can be overcome or mended, which of course mending I think implies that something is broken or has a hole in it. Instead, I tend to embrace regional differences of primordial tension in our confederation, prescribing that we can seldom find a single solution that's going to satisfy Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and that the real art of inclusive Canadian politics is striking a working consensus that does not excessively offend any region. So today we see regionalism deeply embedded in terms of economics, right? The dominance of the oil and gas industry in the West, for example, feeds a sense of grievance with Ottawa and Eastern Canada for what they believe is us siphoning off their wealth. This also crosses over into regional differences in public opinion on pipelines and non-renewable resource extraction and causes of climate change. Right? We certainly saw political regionalisms again during the last federal election, with the dominance of the Conservative Party in the Prairie provinces and much of rural Ontario, in contrast to Liberal dominance in other regions. And we can look to the Albertan Wexit movement, which thankfully seems to be losing some steam, right? But resurrects old ideas about separating from Canada that arose back in the late 70s and 80s when Justin's father Pierre was prime minister, that are another obvious example of regionalism. So given the breadth and diversity of our country, I don't find any of this particularly surprising, right? I'm a historian who teaches about Louis Riel and the creation of Manitoba, and the Maritime Rights Movement, Progressive Party successes in the 1920s, and Quebecois nationalism and the independentist movements, the rise of the Reform Party, and so on. But I also think of Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's comments last October when asked about Western separatism. And Kenney said, "I'm not going to let Trudeau push me out of my country." I thought it was interesting, right? It's emphasizing an emotional connection to Canada, and also points out that Alberta landlocking itself by separating won't build any pipelines, which is what he really wants. So in short, regional self-interest and identity is not inconsistent with a sense of broader Canadianness and a recognition that we gain something as Canadians by retaining ties across a vast space, and I'd say by dispersing risk as well through regional equalization payments. I think back to Harold Innis's observation that Canada exists not in spite of geography, but because of it. It's no longer the arteries of the fur trade that bind us together, but other human transportation, trade, and investment flows and senses of culture. I also think that regionalism limits Canada's capacity for bold political action, which can be good or bad. And it suggests to me that we're likely to continue on a middle path with respect to important issues like climate change mitigation and energy. Right after the last couple of elections, Westerners are angry. So we see a Liberal government taking care not to give them reasons to get angrier. Right? This reflects the essence of Canadian politics, as frustrating as it can be for many of us. That governing Canada is often about trying to avoid provoking a national unity crisis rather than taking bold, decisive action that will bind the entire country together. Heck, even creating a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right, that guaranteed equality rights and other fundamental rights was a source of regional debate and division back in the early 1980s.
Well, and building on the same question, and back to you, David, could you elaborate on the role Indigenous self-governance plays in the discussion of regional identity in politics?
Well, we come to recognize in that Indigenous governments are different, right? That the Mi'kmaq are different from the Algonquin, who are different from the Haudenosaunee, who are different from the Anishinaabe, different from the Cree, different from the Gippsland. And so Indigenous governance is based upon a regional approach, right? And we come to argue with the government that a one-size-fits-all doesn't work, that we have to recognize different cultures, we recognize different geographies, recognize different ways of doing things. And so Indigenous governance then begins to be recognized in different regions. So it becomes part of the regionalism of Canada. And I'll go back to the last question just for a moment, right? Because when I think about regionalism, right, I think about difference. And we often tend to think about difference as somehow being innately bad. Indigenous politics takes a very different approach to it. It recognizes different and acknowledges differences, and then tries to find ways in which people can come together and find some common cause. Right? I'm Onondaga. I'm part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And for the last 800 years, right, we've had a confederacy that consists of 6 different groups that come together, that talk about issues of common interest. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. But the key element is a strong identity as Haudenosaunee. And I think the same thing happens in Canada. We do have regional differences. We do come together. We do talk, and I think we need to recognize that regionalism and Canada as it exists is messy. Politics is messy. It's complicated, and it requires us to constantly talk. Right? There's a story that's always told that Canadian politics is built upon an Anishinaabe view of consensus. Anishinaabe view of politics requires continually engaging in talk, right? And the prioritization of talk, right, over fighting, over war, right? And so, perhaps Winston Churchill in his "I'd rather jar, jar, jar than war, war, war" was the original Anishinaabe. Right? The idea that we come together, that we begin to talk, right? We begin to try to find ways to deal with the differences that arise from our geography and our culture. And I think that's important, right? And we don't say regionalism is bad, we say regionalism is good, and we try to make it work. So I'm optimistic. Right? As long as we continue to talk, right, then I'm hopeful. Because when we stop talking, that I become quite concerned.
Well, I think, David, a lot of your wonderful thinking on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the visions or different models of governance and Indigenous governance that it proposed, and the challenge of seeing some of those visions actually instrumentalized or converted into our governance institutions reflects the challenge of incorporating all of that rich diversity. And I think then, as I think you've laid down wonderfully for all of us as Canadians, is to think creatively about ways that we really practice what we preach about embracing diversity and using it as a tool to do things very creative and innovative. And that has to be predicated on a meaningful spirit of partnership and respect. And like you, I have high hopes that Canadians are coming back to those senses of understanding.
I think it also means that we have to put aside our fears. Right? We can't go into this being afraid. We got to put those aside. And I think if we begin to see the other, right, as our enemy or as someone to fear, then I think we're in deep trouble as Canadians. We could begin to see Newfoundlanders as people to fear, or Albertans as people to fear. That is where I think we're going to have huge challenges to deal with.
Our final audience submitted questions, and Whitney, turning back to you. We Canadians may be humble and polite, but secretly we tend to think of our Canadianness as being a kind of moral lighthouse that others in the world maybe should look for and look up to. But we have come to realize that actually there's lots beneath the surface in Canada, or at least until recently beneath the surface, that we Canadians need to address, and hopefully address urgently. So let me ask the question in the context that Canada failed to secure a seat on the UN Security Council. Now, in and of itself, maybe not necessarily a big deal, but it does suggest that other countries may be more aware of our own failures than we ourselves have acknowledged. So what do you think is the impact on our reputation and relationships, as perhaps evidenced, at least in part, by our failure at the UN?
Yeah, first, I didn't really make too much of our failure to secure that UN Security Council seat as a great surprise or a serious blow to our national prestige on an international stage. Ireland and Norway, who did manage to secure the 2 seats, lobbied hard, are very worthy candidates. Ireland was able to leverage its membership in the European Union to secure a big block of votes. Norway can point to a stellar record in development cooperation and in global peacemaking efforts. By contrast, we pulled back a lot of our development efforts and funding into Africa, for 54 UN seats in that continent alone. And China is wielding a lot of power these days at the UN and in its committees, and is really, we know, working very hard to punish us for arresting Meng Wanzhou on a US extradition request. So some of the relationships that it's forged with countries that might previously have cast a ballot for Canada certainly, didn't help our case. So I think this points to larger structural changes in the world that Canadians, I think, need to be more aware of. Right? We've very much thrived in a liberal international order since 1945. That's reflected a lot of our core beliefs in peace and freedom and democracy and human rights. But I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to find our place in a world of growing major power competition, right? With a resurgent Russia returning to the fore as at least a short-term competitor whose leader has explicitly declared that liberalism is dead. We also have China as a rising global power that will want to revise its place in the international order, maybe even change the international order itself to more clearly befit its self-perception as the Middle Kingdom. So we carved out, as Canadians, an influential global role as a middle power after the Second World War. We've ridden that horse ever since, but I'm not convinced this middle power idea can carry us far into the future. In a world of more disparate power structures, more polarized viewpoints, the ideas of Canada as a helpful fixer and peacekeeper and moderator between states no longer resonates the same way. We're no longer united by the threat of a cohesive external threat like we were during the Cold War. I mean, I wish we would see global climate change as that. I believe it is, but I don't think we've yet come to that point. So accordingly, as Canadians, I think we need to be clearer about what we're seeking to get out of our international engagements and more targeted in our efforts to make global headway on issues like gender equality, for example, where we can have an influence through determined action. And to start, we need to have a deliberate and frank discussion and debate about values we want to project abroad as Canadians. Right? I lament what I see as a tragic breakdown in liberal democratic values in the United States, the eruption of racial violence, the emergence of medial ghettos in which people can live all day, every day, encountering only those views with which they already agree. And I find it very dissatisfying that many Canadian media outlets are trying to mirror the debates going on in the US. I think back to days when Canadians obsessed about cultural nationalism and fears that we were losing our distinctiveness, and I worry that we are becoming derivative in our overall thinking. And I want to return to some of those old burning questions about Canadian cultural nationalism to help us chart our path into the future.
Whitney, I think
Are we critically importing American frames and biases that don't fit with our context? And just to finish up, your structural racism, sexism, colonial violence, the rise and growing entrenchment of identity group politics are all Canadian problems, absolutely. But we should not assume that they are manifest or expressed in similar forms in Canada as they are in the US or elsewhere. And I point to reconciliation as a case in point. I once wrote with a colleague that our relations with Indigenous peoples was the Achilles heel of Canada's good international citizenship. I think our reconciliation approach and focus on relationships is something that's going to do a lot of good in enhancing our international recognition and perhaps get back to showcasing us as that beacon, Stephen, that you referred to.
Yeah, Whitney, I agree with you. Right? I think that if we're going to take a moral stance on the world, we have to get our own act together internally. And I think the way, and that means now paying attention to the inequities within our own country, and particularly around Indigenous people, right? And race relations. I think those are extremely important issues to deal with. And if we can deal with them well, we can demonstrate to the world that we are a model for how to deal with these issues. We're involved in the grand experiment.
Yes. So that's the end of our audience submitted questions. There's a final question that I always like to ask, and you've already hinted at it in what you've been saying, but are there some positive takeaways and lessons related to our discussions today on Canadian society that we can take forward for a better tomorrow? David?
I guess I'm impressed and hopeful, right, that the reconciliation effort will continue. I see a receptivity by many Canadians, right, to understand what happened and why, and then trying to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Right? So I'm hopeful in that. I think the pandemic has shown us, right, as I said before, the structures of power, the inequities, and I think I see in a lot of the protest movements now a desire for change. So I'm quite hopeful that will continue.
And Whitney, is there also a hopeful message you can leave us with today?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think as Canadians, we're at our best when we see our country as an ongoing dialogue. And I think David referred to this very eloquently, this continuous dialogue predicated on a guiding philosophy that we become stronger when our ideas are respectfully challenged by those with different viewpoints, and that we're weaker when we face enforced conformity with any single way of thinking. We need more than ever to show the world that we practice what we preach about acceptance and tolerance and the benefits of open and inclusive dialogue to strive for a more equitable and inclusive world. So I remain hopeful that Canadians will not just succumb to the polarizing habits of heart and mind that are poisoning public discourse in the United States and elsewhere. I believe that most Canadians see the limitations of binary either-or thinking, the limits of absolutizing one's preferred values, which leaves no room for compromise, and of indulging in motivated reasoning, which always and only looks for evidence that only supports one side. When Canadians have held exaggerated and stereotyped views of each other, treated people with different political viewpoints as enemies, and acted as if common ground or a middle ground does not or cannot exist, we've shown our limitations as a country. History has lots of these examples, but it also reveals how Canadians have made tremendous progress in embracing diversity, seeking greater fairness and equity for all Canadians, and promoting tolerance and the benefits of difference. So we now find ourselves in an important era of reconciliation, which, as David has eloquently explained to us, is all about restoring, respecting, and reimagining relationships. And I take solace in the whole notion that reconciliation is inherently predicated on needing to have good faith from all sides, and that it can't take place if anyone harbors an intellectual or spiritual desire to dominate others. So we can still disagree as Canadians. I think we recognize this is actually a source of strength, not of weakness. We can embrace uncertainty. We can apologize for past and present injustices, and we don't see that as a sign of weakness either, right? We have a shared commitment to want to be better. And in this difficult era, Those are values and practices that Canadians should continue to seek to exemplify, and we can do a lot of good by sharing those with an increasingly polarized world.
Well, thank you both, Whitney and David, for spending your time with us today. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And thank you for giving us your insights today. And thanks also to everyone at home for joining us. Please tune in again 2 weeks from now on Wednesday, August 19th, when we will welcome Dr. Momin Rahman and Dr. Moira Howes for a discussion about Zoom. I love the fact, it's very meta, that we will be discussing Zoom in a Zoom-like environment, how Zoom and other online meetings and digital connections are affecting our emotions and our self-images. That will also be fascinating. In the meantime, let's keep the conversation going by submitting questions for our next installment and continuing the general discussions on social by using the hashtag TrentTalks. Until then, be safe, and please always remember you are not alone. Goodbye for now.